This could be a cursed project, not just because it involves watching all 1,225 episodes of a show famous for ghostly chaos and production disasters, but because I've chosen to take you with me. You, unfortunate viewer, have wandered into Collinwood, without a crucifix and without a seance circle. Welcome to episode 1 of what is either a glorious tribute to Gothic television history or a slow descent into madness. I can only describe this series as a catastrophic act of devotion. A full recap of every episode of the original Dark Shadows television series. The one that began in 1966 and somehow ran, limped, howled and time-travelled its way into history. At a time when the airwaves were overrun with overly friendly faces and pastel mediocrity, a single madman named Dan Curtis had a dream. A Gothic soap opera. One with secrets, shadows and a permanent sense of unease. The network said yes, presumably by accident, and so Dark Shadows was born. At first it was a slow, eerie affair. Brooding young governess Victoria Winters travels by train to the ominous town of Collinsport in Maine. She arrives at Collinwood, a mansion dripping in melancholy and unresolved trauma. For the first several months, the show was a subtle ghost story. Emphasis on subtle. But what followed was, simply put, madness. Because Dark Shadows did what no other soap opera dared. It embraced the supernatural. Not coyly, not as a metaphor, but full tilt. Ghosts, witches, vampires, time travel, parallel timelines, a literal phoenix. They threw gothic horror, sci-fi, classic literature, and a gallon of hairspray into a blender, hit Eternal Torment, and served it daily. When Jonathan Frid entered the frame in 1967 as Barnabas, the vampire anti-hero who would become the face of the franchise, the ratings exploded. Children ran home from school, teen girls sent fan mail by the truckloads. And it worked. For a while. But shadows lengthened, budgets shrank, and the tide turned. By 1971 it was over, cancelled without warning. The final week aired with no real sense of closure. No grand finale, just a slow, unceremonious fade. And yet the show lived. In bootleg tapes, convention halls, tie-in novels, audio dramas, fan fiction written by candlelight and regret, the show became a cult icon. Not in spite of its flaws, but because of them. Wobbling sets, forgotten lines, visible microphones. It's the theatre of the unhinged. It may not have found a permanent mainstream audience, but that's exactly what made it immortal. Dark Shadows is not for everyone. It's for us. The outcasts, the dramatics, the tragic romantics and stormy people who see a fog machine and think home. The show meant more to me than I can explain without ruining my reputation. It comforted me, it gave me language for love, grief, obsession, it taught me how to wear a cape indoors without irony. So, yes, this series will be long, exhausting, probably doomed. But we begin here. Episode 1. With a train, a woman, and a house full of people pretending not to hear ghosts. We'll see every creaking door and flickering candle, we'll mock every plot inconsistency, and we'll cherish every drop of Gothic beauty. This is Dark Shadows, and we're only just opening the coffin lid. But this is how it begins. Not with a scream or a vampire or a parallel universe, but with a woman on a train, alone, narrating her own doom in the past tense like she's applying for a job in a haunted house. My name is Victoria Winters, she tells us, calm, poised, utterly oblivious. My journey is just beginning. If she only knew. If anyone had warned her. But then, what is Dark Shadows if not a cautionary tale about accepting employment based on vague letters? Victoria is played with a naive, wide-eyed sincerity by the lovely Alexandra Molka, a newcomer to the screen at the time, hired more for her poised innocence than her experience. She was barely 20 years old when she took on the role of Victoria, plucked from obscurity and thrust into 5-day-a-week production madness. She had no soap opera experience, but she had all the quiet resolve the part demanded, plus the look of a woman who could plausibly befriend ghosts. Victoria believes that this job will link her past with her future, rather than just plunge her into an eternity of ghost drama and screaming in nightgowns. Meanwhile, looming high above the storm-battered town of Collinsport, we get our first glimpse of Collinwood. The home is described as having 40 rooms, most of them shut, the garden strangled by weeds, and the few occupants drift about like emotionally repressed phantoms. In other words, it's the ideal workplace for a young girl. Inside, we meet the grand dame of this crumbling mausoleum, Elizabeth Collins Stoddard, mistress of Collinwood, regal, rigid, and radiating trauma like it's her perfume. Elizabeth is played by the iconic Joan Bennett, a former silver screen siren of the 1930s and 40s, now lending the soap world her icy poise and iron spine. Joan Bennett does not just chew scenery, she just inhabits it like a ghost of glamour past. She was the biggest name attached to the series at the start. She brought a legitimacy, a glamour, and an air of faded grandeur that elevated the entire premise. You believe she has secrets. And here, standing by a window on a howling October night, she sets the tone for the next 5 years. And then we meet Roger, Elizabeth's brother. A man in his early 40s, he's handsome, condescending, and drinks like it's going out of fashion. Roger is played by the divine Louis Edmonds, who's one of the great camp icons of daytime television. He enters the scene with a brandy in one hand and venom in the other. He begins by insulting his own son.
The little monster's asleep and I'm delighted.
Truly parenting goals. He'd go on to be one of the Dark Shadows legends and a total gay icon, thanks to his flair for villainy, his impeccable line delivery, and the fact that no one could sneer with quite the same aristocratic disdain. And this is only his warm-up act. He hasn't even started yet. The scene that follows is a perfect storm of mid-century repression, aristocratic cruelty, and sibling tension so thick you could stab it with a letter opener. Roger wants nothing to do with this incoming governess. He fears change, he fears the strangers, and mostly fears Elizabeth's autonomy. Elizabeth, in turn, shuts him down with the kind of frosty command that could make glaciers shiver.
The girl will stay. The only problem I've invited is standing before me at this moment.
It's delicious. And then, with his trembling hand, his pride in tatters, Roger clenches his fist and crushes the brandy glass. It's a moment of pure soap opera melodrama, and it's glorious. The set may be plywood and the smoke machine may be overworked, but this is theatre. When we last left Victoria, she was careening through the night toward destiny, armed with nothing but a suitcase, a dream, and a terminal belief that strangers who send you vague job offers are simply being polite. The train steams on, cutting through the landscape. Inside, passengers do their best impersonation of not noticing the plot, apart from two: Victoria Winters and the brooding, handsome stranger in the back of the car. He gives "I have unfinished business and like to sue people in my spare time" energy. This is Burke Devlin, played by Mitchell Ryan. His career would veer from Shakespeare to Lethal Weapon to the Halloween movies. In Dark Shadows, however, he's little more than a mood with sideburns. His issues in his personal life end up causing a lot of trouble for the production, and the character suffers for it eventually. But here, in his debut, he's silent, statuesque, and oozing suspicious intent. And you could serve cocktails off his cheekbones. Meanwhile, Victoria has been cornered by an aggressively chatty old woman whose sole mission seems to be sowing dread. She warns of cold winters, failed rail service, and questions Vicky's very presence in the town like she's trying to ward off a poltergeist. Victoria, bless her, just smiles. She doesn't care. She is unbothered. But in her mind, she drifts into our first flashback. We're now at the foundling home in New York, Vicky's former place of living, working, and unanswerable questions. Miss Hopewell, her supervisor, is all clipped vowels and institutional distance. She holds Elizabeth's mysterious letter like it might be ticking.
I don't know why she should offer me the position. I've never heard of the woman.
Well, obviously she's heard of you.
But how?
This is the show's first real mystery. Why was Victoria Winters hired? It's a fair question, and don't hope for an answer too hard, because it's never resolved in the show. In this series, logic is a suggestion, not a rule. The moment she was on that train, the narrative locked the door behind her. She could have walked away, but she didn't. And that's how you know Victoria belongs in Collinwood. Back in the present, the train pulls into Collinsport and the platform is deserted. The mood is desolate, but the vibes are immaculate. Only Burke and Victoria disembark, because of course this is not a place that people go to. It's a place people end up, like purgatory or retail. Burke offers her a ride to the Collinsport Inn, where our next key player awaits. Enter Maggie Evans, waitress, gossip conduit, and woman of wigs early on. She's played by the luminous Catherine Lee Scott. Maggie will eventually transform into the show's most grounded heroine, and occasionally a literal reincarnation. "You're a jerk," she says to Victoria. Jerk. J-E-R-K. And then within 5 minutes she delivers more useful exposition than the entire town will for weeks. The Collins family are rich, reclusive, ridiculous. Their house is a Gothic nightmare, and Victoria, according to Maggie, one born every minute. Burke meets up with Strake, a low-level noir stooge played with grimy charisma. He's been hired to dig up dirt on the Collins family, and this is where we hear our first bombshell, that Elizabeth hasn't left the house in 18 years. 18 years! A woman who owns a fleet of fishing boats and a cannery hasn't once stepped outside, not even to buy groceries or scream at the sky. But why? That is another of the great questions that will haunt this show like a bloodstain under the rug. But no spoilers. Maggie suggests that Victoria stay the night and delay her arrival. Victoria naturally declines. She has to go. She eats her apple pie like it's the last meal of a condemned woman, because in a way, it is. She flashes back again, this time to her roommate who delivers some vintage soap opera tough love. With your looks and brains you could get a dozen jobs in New York. Victoria says she has to go. To find herself. Sure, let's go find ourselves. In a decaying manor surrounded by secrets and potentially homicidal relatives. That always ends well. At last, the taxi arrives. Victoria thanks Maggie for the pie. Maggie, ever the pessimist, says consider it part of your last meal. And then Victoria finally gets to Collinwood. She stands alone, her suitcase at her side as the taxi drives off. No one greets her, no welcome party, just silence. She hesitates and knocks. The doors open with a theatrical slowness, and a voice says,
Come in, Miss Williams.
and just like that, the house swallows her. And that ends the first chapter. A girl with no past, a man with too much past, a family hiding in shadows, and a house that's already started to wake up. The doors of Collinwood have been opened, and now no one will be allowed to leave.